Welcome to Unveiling Nightmares, where we're crafting nightmares one tale at a time. Today we have a special guest, a real special treat for you. Our special guest today is Steve Hugh Westenra, author of the Erstwhile Tyler Kyle. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Cool. You'd think after doing like a million of these, like in the context of like work environments, that I would have this down to a science, but every time I'm like, who am I? Where did I come from? So to answer those questions, I'm a Canadian academic who works on monsters and the monstrous. So I teach at a university level. I'm a PhD candidate, actually. So everything is done except the thesis, arguably the crucial part. And I study, like I said, monsters and the monstrous, and particularly like marginalized reclamations of monsters in fiction, broadly speaking. So that includes like film and stuff. I grew up in Newfoundland, Canada, which is, I think it's actually technically the foggiest place in the world, but like, I know if I say that without a sort of like asterisk by it, like I'll turn out to be wrong. But yeah, but originally I'm actually from England. My parents moved to Newfoundland when I was 1. And Newfoundland's very much the kind of place where like you're if you weren't born there, like, and if your family, like your entire family haven't been there for generations, then you're not from Newfoundland. So like when I came to live on mainland Canada, I say I'm from Newfoundland because people get confused otherwise. But when I'm in Newfoundland, it's like, oh, I'm from England, which seems really peculiar to people not from Newfoundland, but that's how it is. So
sounds a little bit confusing, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell us about your books without obviously giving any spoilers away.
Yeah, awesome. It's kind of a hard book to talk about without spoilers, which has made it somewhat challenging, I think, both for me and for reviewers. But it is a horror comedy, and I've kind of been shipping it, I guess, as sort of like for fans of BuzzFeed Unsolved, if you're familiar with that. Or Ghost Files, which is sort of the successor show. It's an online YouTube kind of ghost investigation show, basically, which is comedic mostly, but a little bit spooky. Yeah. And also for sort of, continue.
No, I was just agreeing with you. That's fine. Don't worry.
Okay. Feel free to yell over me. Not that you seem yelly, like you actually seem like the opposite of yelly, but like you're very polite. But please, like, because I can ramble a lot. So,
oh, you carry on.
Perfect. So, for fans of that, and also, I've kind of also been saying sort of fans of Twin Peaks as well. Just because the novel's kind of got a similar aesthetic, I would say, and I do think that the aesthetic dimension is kind of pretty crucial to horror in a lot of ways. So that to me seemed significant, as well as some of the kind of small town weirdness kind of vibes that Twin Peaks has. So I guess the basic premise is that this YouTube cryptid investigator, sorry, I can't talk apparently, cryptid investigator has a YouTube show with his best friend, and he's kind of the Scully skeptic kind of character, and his friend is sort of the Mulder believer type character.
Yeah.
And his friend kind of runs the whole thing. And he and his friend sort of like on their show kind of play up the sort of flirtatious banter between them, even though ostensibly they're these two straight guys. And, you know, it kind of goes too far, and gradually my main character, Tyler, sort of actually genuinely develops feelings for his friend. Yeah. They have a kind of drunken makeout session after losing an award at an award show, as you do. And so then it all goes disastrously anyway. And you know, haunted by that, he is sort of very quick to jump upon this email that is sent to him that features a video of his presumed dead mother, who's a kind of like Elvira type character. And he was in a bunch of B movies that sort of, had a kind of faux universal sort of style to them. And he ends up sort of following this video and going to this weird isolated island that only lets people in with special permission. You have to fly in on a small plane. But the kicker is he has to go alone. So he ends up there alone, and it's weird. And so he's investigating sort of his where his mother actually is, what her relationship is to the island, what's actually going on this potentially cult-filled island. And I'm doing a really bad job of explaining this. I should have just read the blurb. Oh my God. Yeah, yeah. This has gone way south. But it's the idea is it's funny and it's creepy. It's like a lot of people have described it as sort of having a lot of genres blended into one. So horror comedy, obviously, but it has mystery is a big element of it, and a lot of people have commented on sort of like the romantic side of it as well. So it's kind of got a little bit of everything. Yeah, I'll stop there because otherwise I'll just like keep rambling. So
don't worry. So what inspired you to write in the horror genre?
So I guess a lot of stuff. I mean, for me, thinking back, like I've listened to a few of the interviews on your podcast so far, which have been great, by the way. So thank you for those. They're fantastic. And people usually start with childhood. So in that vein, when I was a kid, I was obsessed with My Little Pony. And yeah, a bit of a different start maybe than some of the other interviewees. And yeah, there's this one. I didn't have many of. I grew up in the early '90s, primarily like late '80s, early '90s. I was born in 1986, and so I had limited access to specific videos or whatever. And one of the My Little Pony videos I had was this one where all the ponies get captured by this evil horned centaur man who had a castle, and he was stealing the ponies' souls basically, but he like transformed them into these monstrous dragons. And that just like utterly fascinated me. And there was this really strong, I would argue, kind of horror element to that storyline, as well as honestly to a lot of the kids' films that I was watching at the time. And I kind of like things like Fern Gully, and you've got like Hexus, I think he is, or is he Nexus? I can't remember. But Tim Curry, anyway.
Yeah.
Playing the evil sludge skeleton man. And as well as sort of Don Bluth films, all of these things, they always have this sort of like unsettling undercurrent to them. And I was always drawn to that. And it was, I think, for me, an important access point in terms of horror, because my parents, and I understand their thinking, were nervous about, violent stuff. And they were nervous about things that might be scary. They didn't care really if we watched anything that had sex in it, but they didn't want us watching violent stuff. And so for a long time, I didn't really have a lot of Sorry?
I said, go figure. When parents do that, they don't mind you watching the sexual things, but they don't want you to watch horror.
It's funny because, it's funny because my experience, like as an adult, interacting with parents, because I used to work at a comic book store, and like it was actually almost the opposite. Like I'd have moms coming in and being like, "There's no boobs in this, is there?" Like, she'd pick up Deadpool or something. Like an issue of Deadpool, and I'd be like, well, no, but like, he blows a bunch of people's heads off, and she's like, oh, I don't mind that, like, so it's really funny to hear people's different kind of experiences of it. But regardless of like, my parents' attempts to, I don't think they weren't trying to censor me in any kind of a way. Like, I don't think they would have seen it that way. I think they were just worried, and they hadn't grown up with really extreme stuff or anything themselves, and so like it was a new world to them, and they had no way to navigate it, no guidepost basically.
Yeah.
Um, so stuff like Goosebumps, my mom didn't buy that for me. I wasn't allowed to watch Are You Afraid of the Dark? But I'd sneak in episodes, and gradually I snuck in more and more of this stuff. Um, Now, what they did let me do, they'd tell me classic ghost stories. So like they'd read stuff like Emerald James, and one of my favorite, horror stories, The Vampire of Crogland Grange. I don't know if you know that one.
No, I don't know that one.
Kind of, yeah, spooky 19th century vampire story. It's one of few things to ever, like fictional things to ever scare me, actually. And I loved it so much. I actually like told the story at a special ghost storytelling class we had in grade 5 and like creeped everyone out. It was like one of these really proud moments for me as a child. um, but my mom would read me scary stories to tell in the dark, like that kind of stuff. And so I think it was those small little moments. And then once I gained access to horror stuff through my friends when I was a teenager, like a young teen, like 13, 12 or 13, and started reading like 19th century horror, like Dracula. I was utterly obsessed with Dracula. The whole passage where they're on the Demeter, the ship, utterly terrified me as a child. It was one of those like classic moments where I was sort of had the book in my hand, which was this big, thick scholastic paperback, and my, like light on in the dark. And I was trying to read it like really late at night because I couldn't stop reading because I was so obsessed with it. And I was just terrified, but I loved it. So like growing up with that stuff. But one of the things I did want to say, having said many things already, yeah, is I guess that like I've always asked myself that question of like, but why? Like, why be attracted to something like this? Like, why be interested in gory stuff or psychologically upsetting stuff or, basically distressing content that like when you think about it at a certain level, it's sort of like, does it say something negative about you as a person that you're interested in all of this? That you can watch Hostel and be like, that was pretty weak sauce. Like,
Yeah.
like, is it saying something about me as a person? Um, but one of the things I remember reading, and I think like, not to embarrass myself, although I've said this many times, like to students and classes as well, so I guess I've already done it. But like one of the things I come back to is actually this Cracked article I read probably about 10 years ago when Cracked was still relevant. Like talking about how horror fans, like a large proportion of them, are actually people with things like anxiety. And I've actually seen this sort of kind of corroborated more recently in some scholarly work that people with anxiety actually experience a sense of kind of calmness from horror, because to them, like you're always already in this kind of heightened state, sorry, of kind of anxiety, of wondering what bad thing is going to happen next, of kind of being super hyper vigilant and hyper aware always of like, are the windows locked, or like, what's that over there, or who's that person who just came in, and like, that looks suspicious, like, and so, whether it's sort of engaging with horror or like watching or listening to something like true crime, which I also do a lot of, these things like it sort of almost intellectualizes something that and makes real something that is only a felt experience for you. And so there's a kind of like suddenly the way that you feel all the time is actually the normal response to the thing instead of being aberrant. Whereas in the real world out there, your reactions are actually quite unusual. And so, like anecdotally, I've talked to people quite a lot who don't like horror, and often like it will turn out they aren't anxious people, or they don't have anxiety or the same kinds of mental health issues that I have.
Yeah.
And so so I found that kind of interesting. I think that's part of it too, like just wanting to probe those uncomfortable spaces a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, according to TikTok, we're all sadists and psychopaths. If you've
Oh
heard
God.
all that was going on TikTok not long ago. Um,
Oh no.
that was
Oh
interesting.
Jesus. Oh God. Yeah, I like some of the stuff like coming like it's a problem with critical thinking. Um there's a lot of great things that I think this is gonna sound super like old, I guess. There's a lot of great things that the internet has done. But one of the things that is bad that it has done is I think like democratizing all opinions about things as being sort of equally valid on a topic. Um, and also sort of this sort of elevation of kind of my immediate dislike of something or my immediate love of something means that that thing is like, objectively, like in an objective, real sense, either good or bad. And now I get to make moral value judgments about people who disagree with me about something that's essentially just personal taste, right? Like, um, you know, very yeah, some of these people need to take a humanities class is what I would say to them. Yeah.
Be an idea,
Yeah.
wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And like coming from like, I didn't say, but I'm trans. I'm a queer person, and like just seeing some of the stuff that certain sectors of the queer community online are sort of parroting that's coming from like right-wing conservative talking points that are specifically being like these sort of institutions are specifically targeting the queer community to try and get them to buy into ideas that have always been hostile to that community. So you
Yeah.
see queer people arguing against sort of our own rights or sort of arguing against the portrayal of queer sex in fiction, trying to sort of like control or limit the degree to which we can express ourselves. And it's quite frightening, honestly. So,
Yeah.
it goes beyond just sort of saying, like, I don't like that thing that you like over there, that's bad, and now I think you're a bad person. It's also there's shades of it that are also used to kind of deliberately and explicitly attack marginalized people specifically. So, yeah, bad times.
Yeah, it is. It's very wrong. Very wrong.
Yeah.
So, which horror authors have influenced you the most?
So I already talked about Dracula, and I feel like, I mean, to some extent, that one's a bit obvious. I like I said, I read a lot of 19th century authors when I was a teenager. I think in part because that's what I had access to, and because like, I have OCD, like actual OCD. I'm not just saying that. And one of my things is like, I find it really hard. I like to go back to the beginning and do things from the beginning. And not that the 19th century is the beginning of horror, because it absolutely isn't. But at least in my teenager mind, that seemed like a reasonable starting point.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of what I read. And weirdly, like, I don't think I write like that at all. So my influences from my horror writing come from a lot of really weird, kind of diverse places. I think to some degree, video games and movies, almost more so than fiction, like, written fiction. Okay. So video games like Silent Hill, if you've heard of that series, um, David Lynch's films, I already mentioned Twin Peaks. Some of this really often stuff that kind of crosses genres a lot. I'm really interested in work that kind of like um, doesn't marry itself too steadfastly to a particular kind of like prescribed set of rules or structure or anything like that. In terms of recent fiction that I've really enjoyed, that a lot of which kind of straddles those genre boundaries. I would say like Alia Whiteley's The Beauty, if you've heard of that one. I believe that was 2011 that came out. So that's a kind of like post-apocalyptic, I would say deeply queer book. Basically, it's one of these ones in which sort of like all of the women have died and there's only dudes. But it gets really weird when sort of the graves of the women, start to bloom and these sort of fungal entities emerge from the graves. And they're sort of anthropomorphic, so they end up kind of coupling with the human men who remain. And there's all kinds of wacky gender stuff that happens that's just like fantastic. So I'd say her, Jeff Vandermeer, his stuff tend for like, I mean, in a very obvious way, it straddles genre lines, but there's a really deep kind of element, I would say, of like body horror to his work. Pretty much all of it. It's very much about the body. And one thing that I've noticed, not just about me, but other trans people, is that we do tend to be very into body horror. We're very interested in that sort of like that theme or that motif of transformation and metamorphosis. So Cronenberg, that kind of stuff. Yeah, like anything like that. Octavia Butler's Bloodchild and Other Stories, I utterly adored. Samantha Schweblin's Fever Dream. Another author, an indie author who I really think deserves more hype than he gets is Adam McComber. He did this sort of weird fiction reimagining of the Gospels in his novel Jesus and John. It's sort of like cosmic horror, like queer cosmic horror. Very strange, hard to describe, so I probably shouldn't try. But I highly recommend his stuff. And then you've got like again 19th century writers, Nikolai Gogol or Nikolai Gogol, as he's often called, his short fiction, and then like Steve. I won't say Stephen King was a huge influence on me. I read some of his stuff as a teenager. Mostly I found it kind of funny. I guess that seems really like not the right thing to say probably, but I don't mean that in a bad way. We had tremendous, like, my friend and I used to read, she had a copy of what was it, one of his short story collections, and we would read the stories aloud to each other, and like The Mangler and all of those ones, and so like we enjoyed it, and there was probably a sort of like, we probably wanted to find it funny but actually found it interesting, but didn't really, we're kind of nervous about expressing that, is sort of what I think.
Yeah.
And then as an adult, I read it, and I loved it. I thought that was a spectacular book. So
That book
he's
is
another
huge.
classic. Yes, it's physically huge, and it's also huge in the sense that it's very popular.
I could never get through that book. It's too big for me.
Oh, that's very fair. To be fair, and my friend lent it to me, and she was like, "Read this," and I was like, "It's fucking enormous." But I also love big books. But then like I did listen to part of it on audio, and there was this really great older version of the audiobook that I just like, I loved the narrator so much. But I think I was like, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. I think I was illegally listening to it on YouTube or something, and then the audiobook. They didn't have the second half. So then I had to go and get a free like Audible account, like a trial one, so that I could listen to the second half of the book. But I didn't like that narrator at all. Like I didn't like the way he did some of the character voices. So like I went back to reading the physical at that point. But I have complicated thoughts on it because like I think he just did such a phenomenal job. And, obviously I just said I was born in 1986. So obviously I don't know what it was like growing up in the 50s.
Yeah.
But you could really feel reading it. I thought sort of like this realistic portrayal of what it's like to grow up in a small town and to grow up at that time in a small town. To be in this hostile environment, because the great thing about that book really is that the monster actually isn't Pennywise at all. It's actually Derry, right? So it's this town where like you can run up to an adult and say, hey, this horrible traumatic thing is happening to me, I'm being abused, in one way or another, whether it's being attacked by racists or, your mom's got Munchausen by proxy or like, whatever the particular thing is. And no one fucking does anything because, it's that's the horror of it, right? The horror of it. And Pennywise is just an embodiment of that. And I think he just did that so well. And I was quite disappointed with the modern movie adaptation because I felt like it watered down. It didn't feel like it captured for the most part the horror that the book was expressing.
Yeah.
With the level of nuance that it ought to have. And there's going to be limitations because it's only 2 movies, right? They only have so much time. But I don't know. I felt like they were trying to cater way too much to a kind of PG-13 crowd. Yeah, I thought it could have gone a lot harder. And I thought they also didn't really do justice to some of the particular characters were sort of left by the wayside.
Yeah.
But I will say, oh, sorry, continue.
I think they've done that with a couple of his films, though, haven't they? They've kind of like dampened it down to sort of like appease a younger audience. It's like Misery.
Right.
In the book that she actually cuts his foot off, whereas in the film she just breaks his ankles. It's a little thing like that.
Yeah. So like you'll find things like that for sure. Yeah. No, definitely. And like, in some of these instances it probably doesn't make a huge difference. But I think, you lose some of the rawness or the texture of it. Like there's and weird choices like there's a particularly I thought one of the more frightening scenes in the book in it where one of the characters, if I remember correctly, he was inside this kind of, it was either a grain silo or like a water tower. And I find water towers like particularly creepy just because of level in Silent Hill 4 that's sort of set inside one. And it was full of birds and all of this kind of stuff. And I don't think that one was in the movie. And it was just like, I was shocked that it wasn't because it was for me, that was one of the key kind of scary moments in the book. And there were a couple of others too, like one of the characters being chased by a giant bird through a field that wasn't really done justice. And like, yeah, just a lot of stuff that it was like, these are key moments in the book. It didn't feel like it was like, well, they had to cut something. It was like, no, they cut these very prominent moments.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I will say, like, if you, I'm one of the few people who actually kind of liked the gay storyline that they added to it in the films. Like, I thought it made sense for the characters based on what I'd read in the book. Mostly people were complaining, to be fair, not because there were queer characters. They were complaining because they wanted one of the characters dies and they wanted them to survive. But like, that's not how it goes down in the book. So like, what were you expecting? But if you liked those characters and you might like my book, because I think my characters are a little bit like those 2 characters. So.
So have you ever scared yourself with anything that you've wrote?
I feel like I have, but like I can't remember. Yeah. I think probably if I was at some point when I was like alone at my desk in the dark writing, I might have done. I think more frightening than the kind of outright horror parts for me, because like the horror in my books, like in the Erstwhile Tyler Kyle in particular, like the gory, violent horror moments are few and far between, and that was very intentional. I thought it would be more successful not to sort of have continuous, like, limbs flying everywhere, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But to have really sharp, precise moments when something lingered, like to linger over the violence or to to state something very blankly and just leave it to kind of like settle or linger in the audience's mind, in the reader's mind. But the other side of where the horror comes from, in not just this, but also my fantasy series, The Wings of Astaroth, is actually, I think, in sort of depictions of abuse. And those aren't written as such to be frightening or to be like horror.
Yeah.
Directly. But I think, or at least I hope, that the kind of realism of it is disturbing on a kind of deeper level. If you've ever been unlucky enough to be in a situation around someone who's in a sort of a rage state, where they're really not understanding what's happening around them, and there is the potential there for them to be violent, or to hear someone yelling at you in a, like, I can't express it exactly, but a particular tone of voice that, I've heard multiple people kind of take on. There's a different kind of bone chillingness to it.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I think that Stephen King does very well in it, with the abusive father. Like, I could hear her father's voice in my head when he was sort of yelling at her. I'm blanking on her name now, with the female character. And in, actually, of all things, the Jessica Jones TV show, the David Tennant character, who can sort of mind control you and get you to sort of do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
So if he says, stick a needle in your eye, like, you'll just do it. But the way he says Jessica's name, like, in that, like, it was just, like, to me, that was sort of bone chilling. And so I think, like, sometimes if I'm writing and I'm drawing on that, and I successfully sort of make myself hear that tone in the voice of a character, I think has probably freaked me out before. But very, very rarely. I very rarely get frightened by fiction at all. Possibly because of the aforementioned, like, anxiety thing, but I kind of am always seeking it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Antichrist by Lars von Trier is one of the things that has scared me. If you've seen that one. But
I don't know. Rings a bell, but I couldn't. No, I can't. It rings a bell, but I couldn't say for sure
yeah,
I have or not.
yeah, I'm not sure if I should recommend it or not. Yeah, I I once showed it to, it's a movie. I once showed it to a girl I was dating who was a really big horror fan. And she was into sort of like, blood and guts spewing all over the screen, like, for the entire runtime kind of stuff. And this was this really slow kind of artsy movie. And so, nothing explicitly violent or anything happens for the majority of the film. And she was sitting there on my couch, and like, she was like, why are you showing this to me? Like, why this? You said this was like really disturbing. Like, why is this? And then, like, the thing happens, which I won't say what it is, at the climax of the movie. That's a pun that might make sense later. And she started yelling, and then she was like, why did you let me watch that? Why did you do that? And I just started laughing, which was probably horrible. But anyway, so I'm an evil person, basically. Yeah.
What's the most challenging aspect of writing for you?
I think, if I'm honest, it's finding the time, like squeezing in moments, in my day, because I'm not able to make a living at this, and so I have to work on either whatever job I have at the time, but also my academic work. But I think, like, in a big way, I mean, initially getting started is always kind of a hard thing. Ripping the Band-Aid off on a new piece, a new manuscript is always challenging. And you've kind of, at least for me, I've always found I needed someone to kind of give me that push. Just, okay, just start writing it. And then once I start going, then usually inertia takes over and like I can just keep on going. But yeah, like I think those are the two things. There's always sort of as well, like the kind of worry about, am I doing whatever it is that I'm writing? Am I doing this concept justice? Am I doing these ideas or these themes justice? Worries over, like how is this going to be received? Like, is it going to be received at all? Because I just made the jump from querying for years and years and years to self-publishing. So I think also that sort of anxiety is sort of like, it's hard to shake for sure.
Yeah.
So I think those are honestly they're probably the most challenging.
So have you got any memorable reactions from the readers that stand out to you?
Well, when my friend Cola, who's my critique partner, was reading the Erstwhile Tyler Kyle, during its first draft, because we kind of were reading each other's work as we wrote, which actually works really well for us. It doesn't work well for everybody, but we like to do that. When he was reading it that way, he told me ahead of time, like, I'm not a horror fan. I get really disturbed during movies, but I'm fine in books. When I read stuff that's written, like, it doesn't bother me. It doesn't faze me at all. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, that makes sense. And he got to a certain part in the book, and he was just like, oh, Eli. That's my I should explain, that's my name. Steve is my pen name. So to get that reaction was actually really good, because it was like, okay, like the horror thing, the thing that I was trying to do, I successfully did it, at least for Koa. So now I can die happy. And yeah, so I liked that. One of the fun things, because the book is really voicey, and it's been interesting seeing the reactions just like immediately to the main character. It's written in first person. It is an adult book, but it's first person, present tense. And so like a lot of people are like, this guy's really fucking annoying when they meet Tyler, or they love him right away. And I did get this one really weird agent rejection when I was querying that will probably stay with me forever, even though like no one else has criticized the voice. Everyone, like, I not to toot my own horn, but people generally like really praise that aspect of the book. But this one agent was like, made a point of being like, this isn't really voicey, it's just irritating. And like, ow. It just, yeah, like it just stuck with me, like that sort of reaction. So that was frustrating. Because the negative comments, they do, you kind of remember those.
It can be quite off-putting, can't it? Because something like that would actually stop someone dead in their tracks. They wouldn't release it or anything.
Yeah, exactly. Like I got to some really low points when I was trying to publish this book, in part because of feedback I was receiving by probably, I think, asking the wrong people for feedback. Because I was very lucky to get into a mentorship program with this novel called Query Fest. Marianne Marlowe, who's a fantastic writer in her own right, writes romance, although she's also a horror reader. She was my mentor for this book. She kind of lifted me out of that, as well as another author, Anna Kaling, who read my book for Pitch Wars, although she didn't take me on as a mentee, but she read it for that. And like I was just at such a low point because I'd essentially been having like the wrong people, like I said, read the book. And at least Marianne, possibly Anna as well, sort of said, like, they just kind of cut me off when I said, well, this person said this or this person said that. And they were like, they're the wrong audience for your book. Like, that's not the audience for your book. Move on. And I think that was really important advice to get. And it's something that I struggle with because as writers, we're encouraged always to kind of listen to what people are saying and to critique, and we absolutely should. I don't mean to say that we shouldn't, but like there were points when I was just starting out in the querying process like 10 years ago, and I was posting like my epic fantasy first chapter up on like forums to get critiques, and all of these writers from like entirely different genres who never read fantasy would give me these lengthy critiques about all of the things that were wrong with my book, and like I treat them with the same degree of importance or significance as critiques I was getting from like fantasy readers or fantasy writers. And it's like, yes, you can critique cross genre if you're a good CP. And I think also if you're editing and writing at a certain level, you're probably level of craft, you probably are able to give pretty good feedback on more generic stuff like pacing or characterization or structure. But yeah, like you don't necessarily want to be taking advice from like every well-meaning but kind of random person you encounter on the internet. Sort of, and I think that that's pretty good advice. Just learning to take the advice that you think has merit to it. Sitting with advice that you don't like for a little while, just to make sure that you're not having a knee-jerk reaction to it as well, and that it's like, sometimes you'll hear something that really pushes a button because we're all really sensitive writers, artists, like this scene totally didn't work for me. This is so much of this is wrong, blah blah blah. Sit with that for a couple of days before just saying no, they're an idiot, they're wrong. I'm not going to listen, because sometimes there's something to that, right? But also, again, just being aware, like, you do need to at a certain point trust yourself. You are the author of this work. Like, there's a particularity to the way that you're doing things, a specificity to it that's unique to you. And sometimes the answer, like if there's something really weird you do in your writing, sometimes the answer is to lean into it as well, right? To go harder with whatever that thing is. It's like, okay, maybe this isn't a bug, it's a feature, right? So yeah.
Totally agree. So how has the horror genre evolved over the years, in your opinion?
Yeah, I found everyone's answers about this interesting, listening to the other interviews. I think it's been, one thing that's been really great is to see it kind of opening up and diversifying. And I do mean that in the kind of like buzzwordy way that you see diversity used. But you see sort of like more space being given for like queer works and works by people of color and like disabled fiction and horror and all of these kinds of things. And I think that is fantastic. So that's a really positive way that I've seen it change, and I hope it continues to kind of open up and become more accessible to people from a variety of communities. At the same time, like those writers have always existed. Queer people have been writing horror for a very long time. For example, a lot of 19th century Gothic particularly is just like repressed gayness, basically. That's the whole genre, repressed gayness. So, like it's not like marginalized people haven't always been attuned to horror. We've seen ourselves represented in horror. Like Frankenstein, the sort of like universal film as a kind of metaphor for like lynching, for example. Like, this stuff's always been there. It's always been in it. But the spotlight's being shone in a different way, I think, is maybe what I'm trying to say. And I think that's positive. What I am afraid of, and what started to, and this is like probably completely foundationless, especially entering into the world of self-published and indie stuff.
Yeah.
But I've been frustrated with the way that trad tries to latch on to niche things and sort of tries to like make them more mainstream in ways that are normalizing and normativizing, I think is probably a better way to put that. and to try and kind of shave the edges off stuff. I don't like that. One of the things I like about horror is that it's all edges. And because there's no subjects that are kind of like verboten, really, in horror, and I think it should stay that way. That's not meant to be like an anti content warning thing, because like people find those useful. I'll put them there for the people who do find them useful. That's fine. And it's not to say that all horror has to be, like Antichrist or like some kind of really graphic, full of like abuse and stuff like that. It absolutely does not. Horror kind of is a very capacious genre. But we should be allowed to write our messy, fucked up stories, is all I'm saying. And I don't like the idea of somebody declaring themselves like, some editor or publishing house or whatever declaring themselves without stating that as such. I'm the new sort of arbiter of what horror is and should be. And you guys are not allowed in this clubhouse anymore. Like, I don't want to see that happening. And hopefully and probably it won't. But, I can be quite paranoid about things, as like probably has been made clear by this interview. So, yeah.
So have you got any upcoming projects?
Well, in a way, the Erstwhile Tyler Kyle is my upcoming project. Just because it's releasing on Friday the 13th, so it's not technically out yet. So it's coming out this Friday, but I'm not sure when this goes up. So yeah, but this Friday. After that, I'm working on serializing the second book in my fantasy series. The first book is The Wings of Ashtaroth, which just got kicked out of Spiffbo, the self-published fantasy blog off. And I'm also working on a sequel to the Erstwhile Tyler Kyle, which is called For One Night Only. And that's kind of really it. I've got lots of other works in progress that I've sort of like dipped in and out of over the years. Yeah. But those are kind of my primary foci, I guess, moving forward. And I wish I could put something else on my plate, but I just like, I'm kind of stretched in 18 directions right now. So yeah.
That's the trouble, isn't it? When you've got so much to do, actually sitting down and writing something, it can be a bit hard.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's challenging. Like, I'd love to just be able to do this full time. Like, that's honestly what I would love to be able to do. But it's, yeah, like there are things like rent and food that need to happen. Yeah.
But you can do without the food for a week or two.
Yeah, exactly. It's fine. You'll find out about that in my book, actually. So
have you got any advice that you would give to aspiring horror writers?
Yeah, I think I mean, apart from the stuff that I've already said, like, I guess just like, and it's easy to say this and harder to do this, but I guess just don't be ashamed of putting, the personal stuff on the page, right? And that doesn't have to mean that you're taking something specific that happened in your life or but sort of like those deep-seated feelings, because I think it's that sort of raw aspect to horror that draws a lot of us in and that we're there for. I've often described like why I like horror to fellow academics is like, when I'm watching really good horror, my gums start to hurt. And like I get this weird feeling in my teeth. And that's like what horror is to me. Yeah. And like I think that's that sort of like that sense, right? Like there's something there, something like you can't really express it with words is the problem. It's not coherent. It's more of a felt thing. It's more of an emotional reaction to something. But to get that, I think you need to be willing to kind of to put some weirdness, some of your weirdness in there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And also just to be, be kind to yourself, like start writing, don't be too hard on yourself. Whatever methodology works best for you for writing, don't let anyone tell you it's wrong also. I'm somebody who edits as I go. I was starting to get really frustrated looking on the internet at everyone saying, no, you can't do that. You have to like just like shit out a draft, and like it doesn't matter if you've got like whole pages that are just like write more here and stuff. And that advice is great if that's what works for you, but it doesn't work for me. And so like I think what if you have somebody who's telling you, no, you have to fit your writing or your method or whatever it is into a box, and it's not the box you're comfortable in, don't try to fit into that box just for that person. Find the box that fits you. Yeah. Find the hole that's just for you.
I mean, that's a bit like the plotters and is it pantsers or something like that? Argument.
Yeah, plotters versus pantsers. Yeah. There's no wrong way. It's just, like, I mean, I guess if you summoned a demon and like, got them to murder a famous author and then stole their superpower author powers, that would be wrong. Yeah. Or if you use AI, don't fucking use AI. Don't be a scab. But yeah, those are the wrong ways. But any other way is a good way.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for being on the show. It's been wonderful having you here. Is there anything else you can add?
I don't think so. I probably should have thought of something quippy. Or, yeah, you can find me on social media, I guess, if you're interested in like rambly weirdness and possibly my books. Yeah. I'm Steve Westenra on most socials. Steve Westenra, Steve Hugh Westenra, that kind of thing. So yeah.
Well, thank you for being on the show. It's been wonderful having you here.
Stay tuned, dear listeners, for more spine-tingling tales and dark discussions in a world of extreme horror. Until next time, remember the nightmares are real, and here on Unveiling Nightmares, we're crafting nightmares one tale at a time.